Clint Eastwood pretends to be a janitor, fires entire staff after they humiliated and bullied high. It was just another ordinary morning when Clint Eastwood, dressed as a janitor, silently wheeled his cleaning cart down the hallway. But when Mr. Davis stormed by, barking orders, Clint's eyes, cold and calculating, watched him without a word. A few hours later, Mr. Davis would learn the hard way that Clint wasn't just any janitor. He was the CEO. And today, all that arrogance would cost him everything. Clint moved through the office with the steady rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times. No one looked at him. He was just another janitor, sweeping, mopping, and quietly going about his work. No one noticed him, not the busy employees glued to their screens, not the managers rushing by with their phones pressed to their ears. But Clint saw everything. He saw how the employees acted and they thought no one important was around. He saw the way they treated each other, how they mocked the janitors and staff who were beneath them. Especially Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, the office manager, walked past Clint with a sneer. "Hey, move that cart, you're blocking the way," he snapped, his voice sharp and dismissive. The words cut through the air, but Clint didn't react. He just nodded and moved the cart aside. This wasn't the first time. Mr. Davis had treated everyone below him with contempt. He barked orders, made fun of the cleaning staff, and treated anyone without a suit as if they were invisible. Clint didn't flinch. He watched. He observed. As the day went on, he saw how Mr. Davis treated people, his colleagues, his subordinates, like they were nothing more than tools to be used. He made harsh comments, belittled those who served him, and laughed as if the world was his to control. But Clint wasn't fooled by the smile Mr. Davis wore in front of the higher-ups. No. Clint knew what kind of man he was. And soon, Mr. Davis would learn that you can't treat people like dirt, not when you don't know who they really are. As the day went on, Clint quietly moved through the office, cleaning, mopping, and wiping down windows. He was invisible to the workers, just another janitor in the background. But his eyes never left the people around him, especially Mr. Davis. At first, it was small things. The way Mr. Davis would pass by and barely look at him, the cold glance he'd give, as if Clint was just another piece of furniture. But as the day wore on, the remarks became more pointed, more mocking. "Still here?" Mr. Davis snapped as he passed Clint near the break room. "You must really enjoy cleaning those floors. Too bad you're not good at it." Clint didn't react. He simply kept wiping the counters, his face calm, his movements slow. He had heard worse, seen worse, but today was different. Clint wasn't just a janitor. As the afternoon dragged on, Mr. Davis's attitude grew even nastier. He began to speak louder, making sure his words were sharp enough for those nearby to hear. "I don't know why we need so many of you around," he said, glancing at Clint as if he wasn't even human. "Maybe if you actually worked faster, we wouldn't need to hire so many people to do your job." Clint didn't respond. He just moved the cart to the next aisle and continued working. But inside, he could feel the anger building. The disrespect was too much to ignore. This wasn't just about cleaning floors anymore, it was about how Mr. Davis treated him, and how he treated everyone who wasn't in a suit. But Clint didn't let his emotions show. He stayed silent, allowing Mr. Davis to continue digging himself deeper. With each passing hour, the comments got worse, and the tension in the office grew thicker. "Can't even clean this hallway properly, huh?" Mr. Davis sneered as he walked past again, his eyes narrowing as if Clint was beneath him. "It's really not that hard, you know." Clint could feel the eyes of the other employees on him. They knew what was happening, but no one dared to say anything. They were used to Mr. Davis's rude comments. They had learned to ignore them, to let them slide. But Clint wasn't going to let it slide. His patience was running thin, but he stayed calm, his face impassive as ever. Clint had seen enough. The time for silence was ending. He wasn't just going to be the invisible janitor anymore. The next time Mr. Davis crossed the line, Clint would make sure he knew who he was dealing with. Clint kept working, his movements calm and deliberate. He wiped down the windows, mopped the floors, and cleaned the break room. To anyone who passed by, he seemed like the same quiet janitor who had been there all day. But in his mind, Clint was paying close attention. He was watching Mr. Davis, listening to every cruel word he spoke. It was becoming harder and harder for Clint to stay quiet. Mr. Davis had crossed a line now. He didn't just mock Clint in passing anymore. He had started to humiliate him openly, making sure others heard his insults. Clint could feel the eyes of the other employees on him when Mr. Davis made his rude comments. They watched, but none of them spoke up. They were too scared of Mr. Davis, too used to letting him treat people like dirt. The final straw came when Mr. Davis walked into the break room, a small group of employees trailing behind him. He took one look at Clint and sneered. "Still cleaning this spot? What's wrong with you? Can't even do your job right?" His voice was loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. The employees shifted uncomfortably, but no one said anything. Clint felt the weight of their silence, but he didn't flinch. He continued his work, his face expressionless. But inside, his patience had worn thin. He wasn't just some janitor. He wasn't just some invisible person to be pushed around. Clint knew it was time. Time to show Mr. Davis that his actions had consequences. Clint stood up straight, looked Mr. Davis in the eye, and spoke, his voice calm but firm. "That's enough," he said. It wasn't just a warning, it was the moment everything changed. Clint wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. The tension in the room was thick, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Mr. Davis stood there, arms crossed, glaring at Clint. The room was silent except for the sound of Clint's cleaning rag gently swiping across the counter. Mr. Davis, eyes narrowing with arrogance, stepped closer. "What's the matter with you? Still cleaning this same spot? You're slow, useless. Maybe you should just pack up and leave. This job's clearly too much for you," he said, his voice sharp and loud enough for everyone to hear. The employees who had been standing nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances but didn't dare speak up. They all knew how Mr. Davis was, his words were cruel, but they'd learned to stay out of his way. Everyone was used to him treating people like dirt, especially those in lower positions. Clint, however, was not like the others. He didn't flinch, didn't show the slightest sign of frustration. His face remained calm, his eyes steady as he continued to clean, the same methodical movements he had all day. But on the inside, Clint felt something snap. He was done being treated like this. He wasn't going to let Mr. Davis continue this humiliating game. Clint stood up straight and turned to face Mr. Davis directly. The room seemed to freeze, the air heavier with every passing second. Clint's calm voice cut through the tension. "That's enough," he said, firm and unwavering. It was a simple phrase, but the authority in his tone made it clear that something was about to change. Mr. Davis scoffed, clearly unimpressed. "What? Are you going to cry now?" he mocked, expecting Clint to cower like he had every other time. But Clint didn't back down. Instead, he stepped forward, meeting Mr. Davis's glare with his own. "You have no idea who you're talking to," Clint said, his voice low but filled with power. "You think just because I wear a janitor's uniform that I'm less important than you? You think you can treat me, or anyone else, however you want?" The room fell completely silent. The employees watched, eyes wide, unsure of what was happening. For the first time, they saw Clint, really saw him. He wasn't just some quiet janitor. There was something about him, a weight to his presence that none of them had ever noticed before. Mr. Davis opened his mouth to speak, but Clint held up a hand, stopping him. "I'm not your servant," Clint continued, his voice cold now. I'm the CEO of this company. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Mr. Davis's face went pale. He stammered, trying to find something to say, but no words came out. His smug expression faltered as he glanced around the room, now realizing the depth of his mistake. Clint didn't let him off the hook. You think because I've been cleaning your floors, pushing a cart, that I'm just a janitor? That means I'm invisible to you? No. You treated me like I was nothing, and that ends now. The silence in the room was deafening. The employees couldn't believe what they were hearing. They had no idea that Clint was the CEO. They had been watching him all day, and now they were learning that the person they had overlooked, the one they thought was beneath them, was the one who held all the power. Mr. Davis was visibly shaken now, his arrogant stance completely gone. I didn't know, he muttered, his voice trembling. I didn't know you were the CEO. Clint took a slow step forward, not moving in anger, but with calm authority. That's the problem, isn't it? You never bothered to find out. You saw what you wanted to see, and because of that, you treated me with disrespect. And now you'll face the consequences. He turned to the rest of the room, his eyes sweeping across the employees. I won't tolerate this behavior. Not from anyone. Not from Mr. Davis, not from anyone here. Clint's words were clear, decisive, and they were not open for debate. Mr. Davis had no room to argue. Clint had made his point, and the truth was out. As Clint turned back to Mr. Davis, his face was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the power behind his calm exterior. You're suspended, effective immediately. You can leave now. Mr. Davis didn't say a word. His head hung low as he walked out, leaving the office in stunned silence. The employees who had been watching were speechless, unsure of what to make of the sudden shift. They had just witnessed the CEO of the company, in disguise as a janitor, take control of a situation that no one had dared to challenge before. The confrontation was over. Clint had exposed Mr. Davis's ignorance, but more importantly, he had shown everyone in the room the true power of respect. And that was something no one would forget. The room remained silent as Mr. Davis slowly shuffled out, his face still pale with shock. The weight of Clint's words was heavy in the air, and no one dared speak. The employees, who had witnessed everything unfold, stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. They had just seen something they'd never expected. The quiet janitor, the one they had all ignored, was the CEO of the company. Miss Rivera, one of the managers who had been watching from a distance, stepped forward, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. She had always known Mr. Davis was tough on the staff, but this was different. The cruelty in his words had shaken her. She couldn't stand by and let him treat anyone like that, especially not Clint. Miss Rivera took a deep breath and turned to face the employees who were still in shock. I think it's time for everyone to understand what just happened here, she said, her voice steady, though still carrying a sense of urgency. The employees turned toward her, their attention now fully on Miss Rivera. They were still processing the fact that Clint was the CEO, but they knew that something needed to be said. Clint stood calmly, his arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. His face remained unreadable, but his eyes were focused, intense. He wasn't angry, he didn't need to be. His actions spoke louder than any words ever could. Miss Rivera glanced at Clint before turning back to the group. What you just witnessed was a lesson in respect, she said, her voice carrying through the room. Clint Eastwood, the janitor you all ignored, is the CEO of this company. And what Mr. Davis did today was unacceptable. The room was silent for a moment, the realization sinking in. It wasn't just that Clint had been the janitor, it was that he had chosen to observe. He had chosen to see how his employees treated each other when they thought no one was watching. And what he saw was a culture of disrespect. Clint's eyes never left Miss Rivera as she spoke. She continued, "The truth is, Clint didn't just take the janitor job to hide his identity. He wanted to see the truth. He wanted to see how we treat each other when we think no one important is watching. And what he saw was not just disrespect for him, but for everyone in this building." The employees exchanged uneasy glances, some beginning to understand what had just happened. Clint wasn't there for revenge, he wasn't interested in tearing people down for his own satisfaction. He was showing them that actions have consequences. He was teaching them that respect doesn't come from job titles or appearances. It comes from how we treat each other. Clint finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. Mr. Davis's actions today weren't just cruel, they were a reflection of the attitude that runs through this company. The kind of attitude I won't tolerate. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in. There are consequences for treating people like they don't matter. Mr. Davis will face those consequences. Clint turned toward the door where Mr. Davis had just left. "I'm suspending him, effective immediately. And as of today, he's fired." There was no drama in Clint's decision. No anger, no explosion of emotion. Just a simple, clear statement of accountability. He wasn't doing this out of spite. He was doing it because Mr. Davis's behavior had no place in the company. The employees watched, some in disbelief, but all silently acknowledging that this was a necessary step. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence of understanding. Clint had set the tone for what was acceptable and what wasn't. He had shown them all that respect, regardless of your position, was the foundation of a healthy workplace. Miss Rivera nodded, clearly relieved that the matter had been addressed. "Thank you, Clint," she said quietly. Clint didn't respond, but the look in his eyes said everything. He had done what needed to be done, not because it was easy, but because it was right. And now, the office had been given a lesson in respect, one they would never forget. As Clint stood there, watching the room full of employees, the weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. The tension had finally broken, but the lesson was far from over. There was something about the stillness that made everyone pause. No one was thinking about titles, positions, or power. They were all thinking about respect. Clint slowly walked toward the door, his movement steady and measured. He didn't say anything for a long moment, allowing the silence to speak for him. The employees, still in shock, stood quietly, processing everything that had just happened. The truth had been revealed. Clint Eastwood, the janitor they had all overlooked, was their CEO. But more than that, they now understood why he had stayed hidden in plain sight. With one last glance over his shoulder, Clint spoke, his voice calm but carrying the weight of his message. Respect isn't about what title you have or how much money you make. It's about how you treat the person next to you, no matter who they are or what they do. He paused, letting his words sink in, his eyes meeting each one of them. We all have a part to play in this company. No one is more important than anyone else. The person cleaning the floor deserves just as much respect as the person sitting behind the desk. Clint's gaze lingered on the group, his words cutting through the silence. Today, you all saw what happens when that respect isn't there. Mr. Davis learned the hard way that you can't treat people like they don't matter and expect there to be no consequences. The room remained still, every eye fixed on Clint as he finished. I didn't do this to punish anyone. I did it to remind you that your actions matter. How you treat others matters. No one is above respect, not in this company, not anywhere. With those final words, Clint turned and walked out, leaving the employees in a heavy silence. They didn't know what to say. They didn't know how to process the shock of the day. But one thing was clear, they would never look at the janitor the same way again. The office was left to reflect on their actions, to think about how they treated the people around them. It was a reminder that respect isn't earned through power, it's earned through kindness, fairness, and treating everyone with dignity, no matter where they stand. As Clint's footsteps faded away, the employees couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. They had witnessed a moral truth that would stay with them long after the day was done. They had learned that respect, true respect, had nothing to do with what's on the outside. It was all about what's inside. And that was the lesson Clint had given them, loud and clear.